Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Frostbite ball python. It's a pretty interesting combination of genes. It consists of 3 genes, the pastel, the cinnamon, and the enchi. And all 3 genes can be extremely variable from one example of the gene to the other. And when you mix them all together to make the frostbite, you can have frostbites that can vary quite a bit in the visual appearance. You can have some that look almost axanthic with almost like a black and white and silver looking snake, all the way to kind of a rusty colored snake, which is pretty amazing. And then when you work other genes into the frostbite, you can get some pretty amazing combinations. Although keep in mind, it's a 3 gene combination. Working other genes into the combination makes it a 4 gene combination, which is kind of hard to hit as far as the odds to hit the 4 gene combo. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Frostbite ball python. Alright, so I want to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to start with the 3 genes that make up the frostbite. And the first one I want to start with is the cinnamon. And take a look at this cinnamon. It's kind of interesting how the cinnamon can really change from one cinnamon to another. This is kind of an interesting one. It actually looks almost like a dark colored normal where the background is really dark. I've actually seen some where they have quite a bit of a rusty color instead of this jet black background. It has kind of a rusty colored, darker background, which really changes the effect when you're working it in with other genes, especially when you work it in with pastel. The kind of the interesting thing with the cinnamon and the pastel, which is also known as the pewter, if you actually start with a really dark cinnamon like this, it looks almost like a dark normal, you'll actually end up a lot of times with a silver colored combination between the cinnamon and the pastel. And if you actually start with kind of the rusty brown version of the cinnamon and you work it in with the pastel, a lot of times you'll get a rusty brown colored pewter. And a lot of times you can just pick up a pewter and look at it and you can tell just by the visual appearance which version of cinnamon that you used to make the pewter. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of different combinations between the cinnamon and the pastel that make silver colored snakes, such as the silver bullet or the pewter. You can also make the sterling. There's quite a few different combinations between cinnamon and pastel that you can get some silver colored snake, which is kind of interesting. So here is pastel, and pastel can be pretty variable too. So most people, when they think of the pastel, they think of a yellow colored snake, and some of them can be really super bright yellow. I've actually had some that are just blazing bright yellow, and I'd say this is probably your typical looking pastel. I've actually produced some here in my collection that are almost like a rusty orange color as far as the kind of the pastel color. Not quite as yellow, it's more of an orange color, which is kind of interesting. I've actually produced some really bright ones here in my collection too. I think there's a whole bunch of different subtleties as far as different versions of pastel that you can actually work with. And here is the last gene. This one can also be pretty variable, and this is the enchi. And kind of the interesting thing about the enchi is pretty much known as a pattern reducing gene. You can actually see on this one, it really reduces it almost into tiger stripes in some cases, where it really reduces the pattern. And it can also bring in some orange, kind of a rusty orange color in a lot of your combinations. And I've actually seen some enchis that hardly reduce the pattern at all. And I've seen some enchis that don't bring hardly any orange in. And I've seen some really extreme examples, even more than this, that'll bring in a lot more orange. And I've actually seen some enchis that just a single gene of an enchi looks almost like a super enchi, where it'll really reduce the pattern even more than this. So I'd say this is a really nice example of an enchi. So here's what happens if you actually take the cinnamon, the pastel, and the enchi, you mix them all together in one snake, and you get the frostbite. And take a look at this. It actually looks like it's kind of frosty, like a black and white. It almost looks like it has like frostburn or something all on the sides. I think that's where it gets its name. It's a pretty amazing combination. So this is actually just one version of the frostbite. And if you actually take a look at this, I would say you're probably looking at, as a matter of fact, if someone handed me this snake, I would think they're probably using the normal version, like a dark normal version of the cinnamon. I think that's where most of the variability comes in. And then you can also tell it has a little bit of influence from the version of the pastel, which can bring in a little of the rusty colored in some versions of the pastel. and with the enchi too. So I think on this one, you just kind of hit all three genes that kind of stripped away all the orange color, and you're left with kind of an axanthic looking snake. I actually pulled up one more version of the Frostbite. So take a look at this. I thought this was pretty interesting. So this is the same exact genes. You can tell there's more of this orange color coming in, and I'm not exactly sure what it's coming from. It could come from any of the genes. It could come from the cinnamon, the pastel, or the enchi, bringing in some of the orange color. And you can definitely tell on this one, it's not really reducing the pattern as much as some of the other versions of the enchi. Although I have seen on a lot of these combinations, it seems like the enchi pattern reduction is almost subdued by the addition of the other genes, the pastel and the cinnamon. I'm thinking maybe the cinnamon kind of reverses some of the pattern reduction on the enchi, which is kind of an interesting effect. So take a look at this. If you actually did hit the super pastel version of the Frostbite, take a look at what it looks like. It's a pretty amazing combination. And when you start working other genes into the Frostbite, you get some really unexpected and crazy patterns. As a matter of fact, if you look on this one, you'll actually see a lot of streaking on the side of the snake. And that is, I'm guessing that's probably from the cinnamon. And in a lot of your cinnamon combinations, you'll get a lot of streaking along the side of the snake. And then you can actually see almost the version of the cinnamon that they use. You see a little bit of kind of the almost like a rusty colored in here. Of course, that could come from the version of the enchi or the pastel in this combination too. And then the super pastel, essentially what that does is it really lightens up the background, and the super pastel will also fade out the head. That is a pretty amazing combination. So here is the lesser. The lesser works really well when you mix it in with the Frostbite. And the lesser is in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you take the lesser and you breed it to any other gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, you'll end up with an all-white snake with bright blue eyes. It's a pretty amazing gene. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of lessers here in my collection, some really big lesser females, and they produce some really amazing combinations. So here's what happens if you take the lesser and you work it into the Frostbite. Take a look at this combination. This is pretty spectacular, and it's kind of an interesting combo. If you actually look, it actually has this really strong stripe right down the back of the snake, and it's kind of interesting with lesser combinations. It seems like a lot of times you'll get striping from the lesser if you work it into certain genes, especially if you work lesser in with leopard. It seems like a lot of your lesser leopard combinations, you'll get a really strong stripe, and I'm thinking maybe it's the combination of the lesser and the cinnamon. So this is actually the pewter, lesser, enchi. And keep in mind, the pewter is the combination of the cinnamon and the pastel. That is the pewter. And then you can also make a black pewter using black pastel instead of cinnamon. Black pastel and cinnamon are really close. And as a matter of fact, you can actually make an allelic combination with black pastel and cinnamon. It's almost the same gene. Some people think they're extremely close. So I think some people think they're the same gene, but I'm convinced that the cinnamon and the black pastel are completely different. Usually your black pastels will have a little bit more of kind of a gold color in your base gene just by itself. It's a little bit different than the cinnamon. And if you actually look at the prices on these are pretty reasonable. So this was back in 2017. This sold for $350, which is pretty awesome for a 4-gene combination. So take a look at this. This is the champagne, and the champagne is kind of one of those double-edged swords. When I first looked at champagne, you know, I was kind of discouraged by the champagne, because if you mix the champagne with a lot of other genes, a lot of times you'll end up with a completely patternless snake. It pretty much absorbs all the pattern, and you get a slightly different colored snake working into the champagne. And lately, the champagne has really been growing on me. I've seen a lot of really awesome champagne combinations that almost have this metallic sheen on the snake, which is pretty awesome. If you take a really close look at some champagne combinations, even though a lot of them don't have a lot of pattern, you'll actually see some, almost like a metallic, almost like speckled metallic flake all over your champagne combinations. And sometimes the champagne just by itself can have a metallic look to it. And if you're actually looking to bring out some of the pattern in the champagne, there's 2 genes that can really break through the champagne and bring a lot of pattern out through the champagne. One of them is leopard, probably the #1 gene as far as bringing out the pattern, and the other one is enchi. If you work enchi into the champagne, it really brings a lot of pattern through a lot of your champagne combinations. So take a look at what happens if you work champagne into the Frostbite. Take a look at this crazy stuff. It seems like the more champagne combinations I look at, the more I'm really warming up to the champagne. As a matter of fact, I might be tempted to buy a champagne and work some combinations into the champagne. So essentially what this is you actually have the enchi bringing out all this pattern into the champagne. A lot of times on the champagne, a lot of times maybe you'll have a stripe down the top. Sometimes you'll have little spots down the top from the champagne just by itself. But if you actually work leopard or enchi, you'll actually get the pattern coming down into the sides. And this is kind of an interesting combination. It almost looks like a frosty champagne. It looks like a champagne frostbite, which is a kind of an interesting combination. So here's the last one I wanted to show you, and that is the freeway, working the Frostbite into the freeway, which I couldn't believe there was one over here. Freeways are one of my favorite combinations. As a matter of fact, they probably have the most potential of all of the genes in ball pythons to make some of the most spectacular combinations. The problem is it's actually an allelic combination between the asphalt and the yellow belly. So the problem is if you take a freeway, which looks really crazy like that, you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as asphalt, half come out as yellow belly, and both the asphalt and the yellow belly look almost like normals, and you can't tell the difference between the asphalt and the yellow belly. They're like pretty much identical, so it's kind of the complicated part of the project. But here's what happens if you take the Frostbite and you work in the freeway. Take a look at this. This is a crazy combination. This is the Frostbite freeway, which has to be a world's first. As a matter of fact, I was looking over here. This is produced in 2020. It's probably the first time anyone has ever produced something like this. So it's kind of interesting if you actually look at this, the details of the pattern on the snake. So you actually have some really dark background on the top of the freeway. I'm thinking that's coming from the cinnamon, and then this actually has the pastel in it. A lot of times you work pastel into freeways and it really gives you a lighter background, sometimes almost a white background, depending on the version of pastel. I've actually seen some pastel freeways that have a yellow background instead of a white background. I think it really depends on the version of the pastel, how it interacts with all the genes in there. And then the enchi kind of really reduces it. And then the pastel also, a lot of times it'll actually give you almost this yellow lightning coming down through the snake, which is pretty crazy. And usually these freeways are really expensive. This one actually sold in 2020 for $2,000. That is a pretty amazing combination. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And John Krantz asks, where can I buy mice to breed? The pet stores only sell males and you can't ship live mice. And that is a very good question. I was kind of wondering the same thing when I first started breeding mice and rats. Where do you get your original stock? And pretty much the #1 place where I found usually they have rats and mice is go to one of your local reptile stores. A lot of times the pet stores that specialize in reptiles will breed mice and rats and they'll keep them in a back room away from the customers. So a lot of times if you walk into the reptile store and you're looking around, hey, where's the rats and mice? You probably won't see them, and you'll probably have to ask someone if they actually carry them. And some of the pet stores will actually breed them, and sometimes they'll just flip them. As a matter of fact, I sold quite a few live rats to some of the pet stores, and they would just buy them and sell them. They wouldn't actually breed them. They were just kind of the middleman for the mice and the rats. Another place you can try is some of your local reptile shows, if they're still open now with the whole, everything that's going on right now here in early 2021 with the reptile shows. Some of the reptile shows might still be open, and a lot of people will bring in some exotic rodents into the reptile shows, and sometimes you can get some pretty interesting rodents. Sometimes you can even get some African soft furs, which seem like they're becoming harder and harder to get live African soft furs. And keep in mind with the African soft furs, I think they're still on the Lacey Act where it's illegal to transport them across state lines. But I do know a lot of people will actually have rats and mice at a lot of your local reptile shows. One other place you can try is your local Craigslist. I've actually seen a lot of people selling rats on Craigslist, which is pretty convenient if you can find someone in your local area. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.